She thought she was booking a yoga retreat to heal from a breakup, but what Chloe walked into was something no one escapes. Hidden deep in Bali's jungle was a sanctuary that promised transformation, but the only thing being transformed was her. The moment she saw the blindfolded woman dragged into the fire circle, Chloe had to make an impossible choice: run and die, or stay and become one of them. But what if the retreat didn't find her by accident? What if they were waiting for her? Would you know a ritual if you were the sacrifice? Chloe Ellis had always been a planner. Her life was color-coded, neatly organized into digital calendars and spreadsheets, leaving no room for error or spontaneity. But when her longtime partner left her for a colleague and the burnout of her demanding tech job began bleeding into her health, her orderly world shattered. She didn't cry at first. She didn't have time. Instead, she opened her laptop one night with trembling fingers and typed "spiritual retreat to reset life." That's when she found it, a website with golden hues, lotus flowers, and a promise of rebirth. "Awaken the soul beneath your skin. Bali awaits," it read. Reviews were glowing, the location secluded, the price surprisingly affordable. Within days, she booked it. No friends, no return date set. She wanted out, and this retreat felt like the only door left open. As her plane descended through the clouds, revealing Bali's lush green terraces and distant mountains, a rare tear slipped down her cheek. This would be her rebirth, she told herself. A clean slate. The moment she stepped off the plane, she was greeted by a soft-spoken driver holding a hand-carved wooden sign with her name on it. He never spoke during the entire 3-hour drive into the jungle, and Chloe was too exhausted to care. But something about the way he glanced at her through the rearview mirror, calm, but almost studying her, stayed with her. The retreat wasn't on Google Maps, and her phone lost signal miles before they arrived. The gates opened not with a creak, but a slow groan like a breath being held. Tall stone statues of beings she didn't recognize flanked the entrance. The compound was pristine, woven huts with thatched roofs, incense wafting through the air, and waterfalls cascading into turquoise pools. It was paradise, almost too perfect. The staff greeted her with pressed hands and hushed voices. They called her sister and placed a red string around her wrist. That first night, she slept deeply, but her dreams were restless, full of fire and chanting voices. In the morning, the schedule was strict: sunrise meditation, raw vegan breakfast, soul-emptying breathing work, silence before sundown. It was rigid, but she didn't mind. It felt like detox. She befriended a woman named Marla, a fellow solo traveler from Germany who had come to find meaning after a loss. They bonded over their shared isolation and laughed about the retreat's obsession with energy cleansing. But by the third night, Chloe noticed things. The meals tasted faintly metallic. Her personal journal pages were being turned when she left her hut. The jungle seemed quieter than it should have been. Too quiet, like the trees themselves were listening. One morning, she found a large smear of red pigment on her door and was told it meant she had been chosen. Chosen for what? They wouldn't say. At first, she thought it was symbolic, maybe she'd earned some special session or treatment. But from that moment on, the staff began treating her differently. They bowed lower, spoke less, and wouldn't meet her eyes. Marla seemed distant, as if warned to keep her distance. During a fire circle ceremony, Chloe caught the retreat director, a serene woman named Ayu, staring at her with an intensity that felt surgical. She was asked to stand in the center and repeat a chant in a language she didn't understand. The others clapped, and Ayu said she was awakening beautifully. That night, she tried to call her sister back home, but the satellite phone in the retreat's main office had stopped working. The next morning, Marla was gone. The staff claimed she had moved on to a higher plane, but her belongings were still in the hut. Chloe asked questions, too many, and was told to focus on her path. Something inside her cracked then. The retreat wasn't a sanctuary. It was a stage, and she had no idea who was directing the script. She stayed up that night, clutching the red string on her wrist and wondering if it was a blessing or a leash. She wanted to leave, but the gates were never unlocked, and the driver was never seen again. The jungle around them was so thick it could swallow sound. Chloe's gut whispered what her brain didn't want to hear. This place didn't want her healed. It wanted her transformed, and not in the way the website promised. By the end of her first week at the retreat, Chloe had begun to notice a strange pattern in the daily routines, a tightening spiral around her that subtly narrowed her freedom of movement and choice. Meals began arriving at her hut instead of being served communally. The yoga instructor no longer corrected her poses in front of others, but instead whispered cryptic affirmations in her ear during private sessions. Most notably, she wasn't included in the group activities anymore. Instead, she was given solo excursions to parts of the jungle not shown on the retreat map, escorted by silent staff members who never let her walk behind or ahead of them. One morning, she was summoned to the meditation temple before dawn. The path to the temple was lined with candles, although no one else was awake. There, Ayu sat waiting, dressed not in the flowing white robe she usually wore, but in deep crimson, her eyes lined with black kohl and her fingers adorned with rings that looked older than time. She told Chloe she had been seen by the spirits and would be offered elevation. Confused, Chloe asked what that meant, but Ayu only smiled and said, "You will no longer be among the ordinary." She was told to prepare her body and spirit through a 3-day purification fast. Her hut was moved to a more remote part of the compound, where the jungle pressed so closely against the walls that the shadows outside seemed to breathe. The isolation became unbearable. Chloe was no longer allowed contact with other guests, and she could only interact with the retreat's high guides, all of whom now wore red sashes and spoke in riddles. They began administering strange herbal tonics, claiming they would open her ancestral gates. These concoctions made her dizzy and caused her to lose time. On the second night, she woke up in a clearing she didn't recognize, her feet dusty, her hands scraped, and a strange symbol drawn on her stomach in charcoal. She began hiding the tonics under a loose floorboard in her hut and pretended to drink them. That same evening, a letter was slipped under her door. It was written in shaky handwriting and simply read, "You're not the first." No name. No explanation. Chloe's hands trembled as she reread it, the words spinning in her mind like a warning left by someone who'd disappeared. The following morning, the red cord around her wrist was replaced with a braided silver one. No one explained the change, but afterward, every staff member she passed bowed lower than before and whispered something that sounded like a prayer. Chloe began to suspect that this elevation wasn't about spiritual enlightenment, but some ritualistic hierarchy she hadn't agreed to enter. She managed to slip into the staff quarters during a temple ritual and found a back room filled with candles, jars of preserved animal hearts, and a ledger. The names in the book were unfamiliar, except for one, Mala. Next to her name was a symbol that matched the one Chloe had found on her stomach. The page was torn, but the next visible name had a thick red X through it. Before she could flip further, she heard a voice behind her say, "You weren't meant to see that." It was Wyan, one of the retreat's silent gardeners. His tone wasn't threatening, it was resigned. He motioned for her to put the ledger back and whispered, "Act normal. You have no idea how far this goes." Chloe left the room, heart pounding, realizing she was being prepared for something, not celebrated. That evening, she was presented with an intricate robe and told she would attend the elevation ceremony at the temple of Sangyang the following night, a place she'd never been taken to before. Ayu kissed her forehead and said, "Tomorrow, you'll finally know why you're special." That night, Chloe couldn't sleep. The air in her hut felt thick, as if something were waiting with her in the darkness. She stared at the ceiling, her mind looping over Wyan's words and the cryptic contents of the ledger. She didn't know what the ceremony involved, but every part of her screamed that she shouldn't go. The next morning, everything was different. The sky looked grayer, the jungle seemed quieter, and the birds no longer sang. Chloe was dressed by two silent women in dark robes who anointed her forehead with oil and draped necklaces over her head made of animal bones and dried herbs. As they led her to the path that disappeared into the woods, she caught sight of herself in a reflective pool, and she didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her face was marked with symbols in ash, her eyes hollow from lack of sleep and food. She was becoming someone else, molded into a figure she hadn't consented to become. The temple of Sangyang was buried in the heart of the jungle, made of volcanic stone and overgrown with vines, yet humming with an ancient energy that raised goosebumps along her skin. As she stepped inside, dozens of masked figures stood in a circle, silently watching her. A chorus of guttural chanting began. Ayu approached her, holding an obsidian bowl filled with a dark liquid, and whispered, "Drink and complete the crossing." Chloe hesitated, the room spinning around her. Then she saw it, hanging above the altar. A red cord, identical to the one that had once been around her wrist, looped and stained with something that looked far too much like blood. Chloe's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a retreat. It was an initiation. The moment the obsidian bowl touched her lips, Chloe felt the world bend. Not physically, but perceptually, the lines of reality softened, and sound seemed to pulse in her veins. She didn't drink the liquid, but the scent alone was enough to make her head swim. The chanting surged louder, and the masked figures encircled her, closing the space between them with mechanical precision. Their masks weren't decorative, they were grotesque, carved wooden faces with exaggerated smiles and bulging eyes, each one more disturbing than the last. The flickering torches painted their robes in hues of blood and ash. Ayu stepped forward and placed her hand over Chloe's chest, murmuring something that felt more like a command than a blessing. Chloe's legs buckled, but she was caught and held up by two robed men, their grip firm and cold. That's when the woman was brought out. Blindfolded, hands bound, her mouth gagged. Chloe's heart dropped as she recognized her. The shy Japanese girl named Hannah, who had only been at the retreat a few days and had spoken very little. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her body trembling. She was placed at the center of a stone circle etched with strange symbols, and the masks turned to Chloe. "You must accept the offering," Ayu whispered. "Or you will become it." Chloe stared in horror as Ayu held out a curved ceremonial blade, its hilt carved with the same swirling motif that adorned Chloe's new robe. Her mind screamed to run, but her body was frozen, trapped by 100 watching eyes. Hannah moaned beneath her gag, trying to speak. Chloe looked into her face, into the soul of someone who knew the end was near, and everything inside her shattered. This wasn't a spiritual rebirth. It was a culling. A sacrifice to something these people believed would reward them. The group began swaying, humming low, guttural tones that made Chloe's teeth ache. Somewhere in the shadows, drums began to beat, slowly at first, then building into a feverish rhythm. A hand guided Chloe forward. Her fingers brushed against the knife. Then the world paused. She dropped the blade. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Ayu's face darkened. "She is not ready," someone hissed. But Ayu shook her head. "No. She is resisting because she was born to transcend." Chloe was dragged away from Hannah, who collapsed onto the floor as the chanting stopped abruptly. Two robed figures lifted her and carried her into the darkness. She was gone. Chloe tried to scream, but nothing came out. Her voice had abandoned her. She was escorted down into a subterranean chamber beneath the temple. It smelled of mold and incense, earth and old death. Torches lined the tunnel, and carved symbols glowed faintly on the walls, as if reacting to her presence. The air grew colder, thicker, until breathing felt like swallowing glass. She was thrown into a small room with only a woven mat and a bowl of water. A heavy door slammed shut behind her. For hours, or maybe days, she couldn't tell anymore, she was left in darkness. No food. No sound except the distant throb of drums and her own thundering heartbeat. She thought about the ledger, about Wyan's warning, about Hannah's eyes. She began scratching into the dirt floor with her nails, marking time, carving symbols she'd seen so many times now they burned behind her eyelids. Then, on what she guessed was the third day, the door opened. Ayu entered, alone, unmasked. Her face was human, yes, but no longer kind. She knelt and spoke calmly. "You were never chosen by us, Chloe. You were summoned. This place found you because your blood calls to it." Chloe demanded to know what she meant, but Ayu only replied, "You're not here for healing. You're here to complete what your mother started." The shock was immediate and raw. Her mother had died when she was a baby, or so she'd been told. Chloe's aunt raised her, always evasive about her parents' past. Ayu handed her a weathered photo. Chloe's mother, unmistakably, stood at the same retreat, younger, smiling, and holding the same silver-braided cord Chloe now wore. Behind her were masked figures, the temple, unchanged. Your mother tried to escape the calling. But in doing so, she left it to you. Chloe's mind whirled, grasping for logic, for reality. This was delusion, cult manipulation, psychological warfare. But her heart began to betray her. She remembered dreams as a child, temples, fire, faces in masks. Recurring images she never understood until now. You were born into this legacy, Ayu continued, her voice gentle like a lullaby, and resistance only delays the inevitable. The door slammed again. Left alone once more, Chloe felt her sanity slipping. Everything was lies. Or was it truth distorted by madness? She needed to act before the ceremony resumed. Before they made her into something she couldn't undo. She paced the room like a caged animal until she found it, a loose brick behind the mat. Inside it, tucked in a hollow, was a note. Just 2 words. Tonight. Run. The sun dipped low beyond the dense canopy of the Balinese jungle, casting long, trembling shadows across the compound as Chloe sat silently on the woven mat, heart thundering, mind blazing with dread and fragile hope. That hidden note, tonight, run, felt like a breath of oxygen in an atmosphere that had been choking her spirit for days. She read it over and over, committing its brevity and urgency to memory, wondering who had written it and whether they had paid the price for helping her. There was only one person who came to mind. Wyan, the gardener with tired eyes and hands that never shook, who had once warned her in whispers and gestures that this place went deeper than she could ever imagine. She clutched the scrap of paper so tightly it nearly tore in her fist. The retreat had trained her, unwittingly, to hide her emotions. She wore stillness like armor now, masking the panic brewing underneath. They were watching her. Always. Even in solitude. The walls had ears, and she was convinced the jungle did too. But tonight, she would risk everything, because staying meant surrendering not just her body, but her identity, her very soul. She pretended to comply with the preparations. When the masked figures came to cleanse her, she let them anoint her body with bitter oils and dress her in ceremonial silk. She chanted when asked, bowed when ordered, and swallowed their concoctions without flinching, though she kept a hidden pouch of herbs Wyan had passed to her, bitter roots he claimed could counteract their sedatives. As darkness settled, Chloe's senses sharpened, every noise heightened, the rustle of robes, the creak of wooden doors, the soft chimes that signaled movement through the compound. The jungle beyond the stone walls had always felt like a barrier, a prison, but now it represented freedom, if she could reach it. She mapped her escape in her head repeatedly. Exit the temple, bypass the fire circle, avoid the torch guards, and find the utility shack Wyan had once shown her during an early walk. Beneath it, he had hinted, lay a disused path, overgrown but real, an emergency exit that had once been a servant's route. No one used it now, he said. No one but ghosts. At midnight, as the retreat began its humming prayers to mark the blood moon's rise, she made her move. Slipping out of the back chamber, she stayed low, wrapping her ceremonial robe tight to conceal her movement in the moonlight. The drums had not started yet, that would come soon, and with them, the trance. If she waited too long, the chanting would rise and cloak every inch of the retreat, giving her a narrow auditory shield to run. But she needed a signal, something to let her know it had begun. A gong rang out once, twice, and on the third chime, she saw her chance. She dashed across the open corridor, ducking behind the shrine of the Four Eyes, a grotesque sculpture she now recognized as a guardian effigy, not a deity. Its 4 faces stared in every direction, as though challenging her to run. She whispered an apology to it, then kept going. The utility shed was in sight when a figure stepped out from the trees. It was Wyan. He looked older, thinner, like life had been draining out of him since she last saw him. But his eyes still held resolve. Without speaking, he lifted a stone slab beside the shed, revealing a narrow tunnel, pitch black and sloping down. Chloe hesitated only a second before climbing in. Wyan didn't follow. "You can't come," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is your story," he said, closing the stone gently. "Mine ended long ago." The tunnel reeked of damp earth and ancient decay. She crawled for what felt like hours, scraping her knees and palms, feeling her way forward with only instinct and desperation. Strange glyphs had been scratched into the dirt walls, markings that pulsed faintly as if reacting to her breath. She ignored them. She couldn't think about curses or spiritual portals. Not now. Not when escape was near. Eventually, she emerged into a dense thicket of trees, the jungle so thick it strangled the moonlight. The sounds of the retreat were distant now, faint drums echoing like the heartbeat of a dying beast. She pushed through vines, ducked under thorny branches, and followed the riverbed as Wyan had instructed. When she reached a clearing, she allowed herself to breathe, sinking to her knees in the mud. But relief was premature. A sound cracked through the silence, a twig snapped. She turned. A silhouette approached, tall and slow, carrying something in its hands. She stumbled backward, slipping on wet ground, ready to run again. But it wasn't a masked figure. It was Marla. She was alive, barely. Her robes were torn, her eyes wild with exhaustion, but her voice was steady. "They let me go," she said. "They said if I delivered you back, I could live." Chloe's mouth went dry. Betrayal twisted in her gut like a blade. Marla stepped closer, holding out a silver cord. "Please," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "I don't want to die." Chloe took a step back, rage and heartbreak crashing together in her chest. "Then why come here?" she asked. Marla fell to her knees. "Because they promised. But I couldn't do it. I saw you in the cave. I couldn't be like them." Chloe's instinct screamed not to trust her, but something in Marla's collapse, the way her body shook with remorse, felt real. Together, they moved deeper into the jungle, neither fully trusting the other, but bonded now by survival and shared terror. Chloe didn't know where they were going, but forward was the only direction left. Behind them, in the distance, the sky glowed faintly red. The blood moon had risen, and with it, the ritual would begin, without her. Or so she hoped. By the time Chloe and Marla found the abandoned ranger outpost hidden in the northern ridge of the jungle, the moon had risen high and blood-red above the canopy, casting a sinister glow over the land below. The structure was dilapidated, but it offered shelter, for cracked walls, a rusted roof, and silence that felt alien after the pulsing ritual chants of the compound. Marla curled into a corner, shivering despite the humidity, while Chloe stood at the window, staring at the unnatural hue of the moon, her thoughts a maze of confusion, betrayal, and dawning clarity. She thought she had escaped the worst, but something was still pulling at her, an unease that twisted in her stomach like an anchor line. The forest no longer felt like safety. It felt like an audience. The stillness was a lie. Marla hadn't spoken since they collapsed into the outpost, her eyes sunken, her mind elsewhere. Then she stirred and, without turning, whispered, "They said your blood would complete the cycle." Chloe's breath caught. She turned slowly, her pulse hammering in her ears. Marla met her gaze, not with malice, but with a resigned, broken kind of honesty. "You were never meant to leave," she said. "You were meant to awaken." Chloe demanded answers, her voice shaking with rage. Marla finally confessed that she'd been brought to the retreat not for healing, but as a vessel scout, a sacrificial placeholder until the real heir arrived. That heir was Chloe. The rituals, the isolation, the visions, all part of a plan laid long before she was born. Her mother had fled this path and in doing so passed the curse on to Chloe, binding her bloodline to the society's unfinished ascension. Marla had learned too late what that meant and tried to escape, but they had found her. What they did to her in the cave of regression, she never fully said, but the pain in her eyes painted a clear enough picture. Her reward for delivering Chloe back would have been release, but she had failed, and now there would be consequences. Chloe tried to make sense of it, the implication that this retreat had watched her since childhood, that her arrival wasn't chance but choreography. Her nightmares, her need to run, the retreat ad that found her at her lowest moment, it had all been orchestrated. The walls seemed to close in. But before she could respond, the jungle screamed. A sound like 1,000 animal cries echoed through the trees, primal, guttural, rhythmic. The ritual had begun. The blood moon ceremony was not a metaphor. It was real. Chloe and Marla bolted from the cabin, drawn by instinct and dread toward the origin of the sound. Through the trees, flames danced, casting chaotic shadows. The retreat compound had transformed into something monstrous. Torches lit in spirals, masked figures chanting in synchronized madness, and at the center, a stone altar built atop a towering staircase of black volcanic rock. Chloe's breath stilled as she saw her own face, a giant effigy carved from wood and smeared in what looked like dried blood. At its base, Ayu stood adorned in crimson robes, holding a book bound in human skin. She was surrounded by elders, their faces hidden behind masks that shimmered as if alive. Chloe and Marla crouched in the underbrush, but the air shifted. Ayu lifted her eyes and said, "She is near. The vessel has returned." The congregation erupted in chants, and the jungle around them seemed to recoil. Marla grabbed Chloe's hand. "We have to end it," she said, and pulled a small object from her robe, a bundle of firecrackers soaked in oil, wrapped around a lighter. "Wyan left this for us. He knew it would come to this." Chloe hesitated. Fire against faith. Flames against centuries of belief. But she knew there was no other way. They circled through the jungle's edge, reaching the storage hut behind the altar platform. Inside were barrels of dried herbs and oils, the retreat's sacred reserves. Chloe doused the area with the accelerant, her hands shaking as the firecrackers hissed in Marla's grip. As Ayu raised her arms toward the moon, reciting the final incantation, Chloe lit the fuse. The explosion wasn't massive, but the fire spread instantly, devouring the hut and crawling toward the altar. Screams erupted. The masks scattered. But Ayu remained still, eyes closed, smiling. Chloe ran forward, seizing the moment, climbing the altar steps toward the effigy that bore her face. Flames reached for her ankles, and smoke curled around her, but still she climbed. At the top, she grabbed a ceremonial torch and drove it into the heart of the effigy. It erupted, collapsing into itself in a burst of embers and ash. A wind howled through the compound, unnatural and deafening. The sky seemed to shake, and for a brief moment, the blood moon flickered, pulsed, then turned pale. The chanting stopped. The elders fell silent. Ayu dropped to her knees, blood trickling from her mouth, whispering, "It's done. The gate is sealed." Chloe stumbled back, coughing, crying, burning from inside and out. Marla pulled her away, and together they ran into the jungle, the fire behind them growing into a column of smoke that would be seen for miles. As they collapsed miles away beneath the stars, Chloe didn't feel relief, only numbness. Something had ended, yes. But something else, she feared, had only just begun. Weeks had passed since the retreat was reduced to ashes, but the smoke hadn't cleared from Chloe's life. She returned to the world she had once called home, but it didn't recognize her, and she no longer recognized it. The city lights felt too bright, the streets too loud, and ordinary conversations sounded hollow against the deafening silence she carried within. She moved in slow motion, haunted not by what she'd seen, but by what she'd become to survive it. She told no one the full story, only vague half-truths to friends and family who believed she'd been on a yoga trip gone wrong, never daring to speak of the blood moon or the effigy or the altar carved with her name. The dreams came nightly, not always nightmares, but too vivid to ignore. Chanting in languages she didn't know, visions of Ayu whispering, "You've sealed the gate, but the key lives in you now." She started sleeping with the lights on. Her appetite vanished. And still, she couldn't let herself forget. That would be more dangerous than remembering. She researched compulsively, ancient rituals, Balinese mythology, cult behavior, inherited blood rites, searching for answers that would allow her to reduce it all to folklore, to myth. But the more she uncovered, the more it all seemed real. Too real. Marla had disappeared 2 days after they reached civilization. She left a note in Chloe's bag that read, "We were spared. That doesn't mean we were freed." Chloe reported the fire to the embassy using a burner phone, staying anonymous. No news ever came of it. No arrests. No media coverage. It was as if the compound never existed. A land development company now owned the property, claiming they were building an eco-resort. She followed it all online, obsessed, waiting for something to slip through the cracks, a photo, a strange report, a name she recognized. But the media stayed silent. The world had moved on. She hadn't. One night, after days of ignoring phone calls and leaving her laptop open on fringe conspiracy forums, she returned to her apartment to find a small package on her doorstep. No postage. No address. Just her name, written in thin black ink. Her hands shook as she brought it inside. Inside was a single object wrapped in black silk, the ceremonial mask from the ritual, the one worn by the figure who led the chants before the blood moon rose. It was pristine, untouched by fire, its surface impossibly cold. Beneath it, a note. 3 words: "The vessel endures." Panic closed in like a vice, and Chloe fled her apartment, discarding the mask in a city dumpster miles away. But the next morning, it was on her pillow. The same mask. Same note. No signs of entry. No security footage. It had found her. She burned it again, doused it in lighter fluid, watched it blacken and curl into nothing. But a week later, a package arrived at her workplace. No return address. Just the mask. Again. Now she understood. This wasn't over. It had never been a matter of escaping the retreat, it was about what had been awakened in her. She began experiencing blackouts, waking up in unfamiliar clothes, mud on her hands, strange cuts along her arms in geometric patterns. At first, she feared she was losing her mind. Then she began keeping a voice recorder beside her bed. In the mornings, she'd play them back and hear herself speaking in that same ancient tongue, whispering rituals she couldn't remember learning. Her own voice, transformed. It was happening again. Or perhaps, it had never stopped. She sought help, therapists, spiritual guides, even shamans. But none could explain the way mirrors sometimes flickered when she passed or why children stared at her like they knew her from a forgotten myth. One psychic trembled and refused to see her again after holding her hand for only seconds, saying, "Something ancient walks with you." Chloe stopped trying to fix it. She accepted that something was inside her now. The retreat didn't end with the fire, it had only shed its skin. The society, the ritual, the blood moon, they were never just a cult. They were a gate. A beacon. And Chloe, whether she liked it or not, had become a vessel not just for their prophecy, but for the entity they had once tried to summon. But there was one thing they hadn't accounted for: her will. If she had the power to destroy the effigy and collapse the altar, perhaps she could bend this power within her toward something else. Not redemption. Not revenge. But disruption. A new fire. Chloe began writing everything down: symbols, phrases, visions, dreams, documenting what the society had tried to erase. She stopped hiding. If they wanted a vessel, they would have to reckon with one who remembered. She rented a cabin deep in the woods, away from noise, away from watchers. There, she studied herself, monitored her trances, recorded her own voice at night. She stopped being afraid and started preparing. Because deep down, she knew something no one else did: they weren't done with her. Not yet. The mask may come again. The society may rise elsewhere. But she would be waiting. Watching. Awake. A vessel, yes, but no longer theirs.